think it's obvious to everyone that a great deal of Jewish life is analyzing text, or using text, and then your mind gets engaged. Like, for example, davening. You're davening from a text. There's a particular set of words you're supposed to say. And as you do it, often, typically you think, what did I just say? And what did that mean? And why did I say this first and that second? Those questions occur to you. And it's a main Jewish religious activity. So we are going to have a variety of texts, some from the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash, and some from other books of the Hebrew Tanakh, the Bible, and some from Mishnah and other places. They all share certain traits together as to how they should be read and how they should be analyzed. And then there are variations, which we can talk about. Today I want to give a certain general orientation, background, both philosophical and Jewish, to how we look at text, so that at least this will be on record, and sometimes these issues come up later, and I'd like to put them on the table at the beginning. There is a certain set of ideas and understandings and misunderstandings and principles called postmodernism. One of the ideas, of course, it means different things to different people, and different people have different lists, and so on and so on. But one common idea in this approach is that texts don't mean anything. Written language, words, don't mean anything. Different people use them in different ways and think about them in different ways. There are different associations. And there's nothing more than, when I read it, this is what I think of. And when you read it, that's what you think of. But the idea that the text has a meaning is just a complete mistake. Gee, that's pretty radical, I would say. It's pretty extreme. Really, the text itself has no meaning, and we just have our own associations and our own usages of the text. Let me ask you a question. I have been negotiating a certain joint deal with another party, and in the contract it says that on the 15th of every month I have to deliver him $10,000 in cash to his office, and I sign. So the 15th of the month I come into his office with a box with $10,000 in cash. January, February, March, April, May. June, I come in on the 15th with a box. He opens it up, and there are 10,000 Monopoly dollars. So he says, what's this? Where's my money? Here it is, see? It's dollars, isn't it? No, it isn't. Sure it is. It's Monopoly dollars. It says so right on the box. Monopoly dollars. Monopoly dollars aren't dollars. Sure they are. They're called Monopoly dollars. They are dollars. That's what I understand the contract to mean. I understand it to include Monopoly dollars. That's my meaning in the contract. Could you possibly take that seriously? Could you think that there was an unsolvable question here? Maybe I really did pay him according to what the contract means to me, and then how can you fault me if I lived up to what the contract means to me? I hope you agree that this can't be taken seriously. It isn't even a joke. I'm glad nobody laughed. It's just dumb. It's just stupid. There's something in the popular culture which used to be called a Dear John letter. A couple is supposed to have a certain relationship, and then he gets a letter from his former close partner. Dear John, I never want to see you again. He's in despair. The world is falling apart. Goes over to his friend. He says, "No, don't worry. It's not a problem. You're just not interpreting it correctly. Dear John means I love you very much, And I never means I never will forget about you, and I never will leave you. And see you means I want to see you tomorrow. And anymore means we'll do this on every Thursday. That's it. No problem. Just interpret it that way. Is that real comfort? Does he feel better now? Is he confident now? I don't think so. Why not? Because that's not what it means. It means I never want to see you anymore. That's what it says. And when it says dollars, it means U.S. dollars, U.S. currency. Doesn't mean monopoly dollars. That's what it means. So the idea that a text has no meaning is just, there was a whole group at Yale University who took this position that texts have no meaning. I would like to have reread their contracts to them in the way in which an administrator reads them, that at any point in time, for no reason whatsoever, I can fire you at will. That's the way I read it. I wonder how far I would get, how seriously they would take that. So the idea that texts have no meaning is just beyond the pale. But now a person could say, look, different cultures have different uses for text. Even within a culture, there are different types of texts that have different uses. You don't read a scientific textbook the way you read a novel. In particular, when you read a novel, usually everything that's said in the novel is false. He said to her, and she went there, and they bought those tickets and so on and so on. There are no such people, and none of the events took place. And it doesn't matter that it's false. And in the physics textbook, everything what's said it better be true, or you try to make it true. Most of what's said in the physics textbooks today aren't true, and they'll be replaced by better things later, but at least you're trying to make it true. Well, that's because a textbook has one function, and a novel has a different function. So yeah, how you read a text is relative to the function that it has, and that will determine what criteria you use for analyzing it, interpreting it, and evaluating it. So then people say, oh, so it's relative. Well, if it's relative, there's no right or wrong, there's no true or false, there's no correct or incorrect. If it's relative, then you can say whatever you want. It's not absolute, it's not objective, it's not fixed, it's relative. That's another mistake. This is it's a deeper and slightly more subtle philosophical mistake, but it's a mistake, and I'll show you why. Am I moving at this moment? Whatever you answer is incorrect.
Yes and no.
If you say yes, it's incorrect. If you say no, it's incorrect.
Well, we said both.
Then if you mean what you say, you're contradicting yourself. That's surely wrong, right? No, but you see, motion is relative. Am I moving with respect to the table? No. Am I moving with respect to the sun? For sure. The earth is revolving around the sun. So, am I moving? Well, it's relative, you see. So, I can't answer the question because the question hasn't yet been spelled out. Since motion is relative, in order to ask the question, you have to ask, am I moving with respect to x? Give me an x, and then there's a relationship, and then you'll get a yes or no answer. Am I moving with respect to the table? No. With respect to the sun? Yes. So motion is relative. That doesn't mean you could say whatever you want, and it's all up to you, and there's no facts of the matter, and no one contradict you. All it means is fill in what it's relative to. When you fill in what it's relative to, then you get true and false, correct and incorrect. Someone says that I'm moving with respect to the table, that's just wrong. I'm not. And if he says I'm not moving with respect to the sun, that's also wrong, because I am. So to say something's relative doesn't mean it's free and no standards and nothing's correct or incorrect, and you can say whatever you like. It just means that when you investigate the subject, fill in what it's supposed to be relative to. Is it right or wrong to drive on the left side of the road? Well, that depends, right? If you're in New York, it's wrong, and if you're in London, it's right. It's correct, right? You don't fill in where you're talking about, you haven't asked the question yet, because right or wrong in driving depends upon the local laws. But once you fill it in, it's no longer up to you and subjective, and there are no rules and standards. If you're talking about driving in New York, driving on the left side of the road is wrong. And if you're talking about London, then it's not wrong. It's okay, it's correct. So to say that something's relative doesn't mean there are no standards. And like I said before, when we take the difference between a physics textbook and a novel, how you interpret them depends upon what they're supposed to be doing, what function they're supposed to play, for which population was it written, what's their purpose in reading it. So of course, interpreting, analyzing, and evaluating a physics textbook isn't the same as doing that for a novel, because it's relative to different social purposes. But once you tell me what the social purposes are, then the question of how to interpret it, what's a correct or incorrect interpretation, and how to evaluate it is fixed by knowing what it's relative to. So when you say that things are relative, it doesn't follow that there are no standards. Yeah.
Even if, like you're saying, the context of the situation, even if like solve this problem in a lot of cases, like for the example that you gave, with not moving. So whether we ask whether the Rav moved in this specific moment, the answer would be no. But if it will become like a physics experiment and each particle matters, so everyone moves a bit, right? So the context solve it, isn't it?
I don't see. It depends upon what you mean. The person, if he asks whether a book is moving, he's not talking about the particles. That's not what he intends to do.
In which conversation?
Well, it will depend upon the conversation. If it's between two people in this class who are asking about whether the book is moving is one thing, and if you're in a physics laboratory, it'll be something else. But then the context will determine what exactly the criteria are, and there'll be a right or wrong answer to it within that context. That's quite right, of course. There are any number of different contexts in which you can do it, right? But if somebody says, "Is this a hard question?" Well, if it's 6th grade, you'll get one answer, and if it's 12th grade, you get a different answer. That doesn't mean there isn't any right answer for it. When you fill in that it's 6th grade, you get one answer. When you fill in that it's 12th grade, it's another answer. I'm just talking now about people who think that because something's relative, therefore all bets are off. And that's simply not correct. Now, here's another thing. I'm going to give a silly example, but you'll see when we come to the text we're going to do, there'll be people who will do this sort of thing. Let's see, how can I have to find a character with whom you're all familiar? Have you all heard of Macbeth? Yeah, I mean, probably not. You can't say yes. I'm asking for everybody, right? Or the famous character that you know from popular literature. Harry Potter. Okay. So now, suppose that I say, I've seen the Harry Potter, the movie. I've read the books, and I think. I interpret the story as Harry Potter is really trans. You say, what? That's why I interpret it, right? And here's my reason. I say, show me where the book says he's not. Show me where the author says Harry Potter is not trans. Doesn't say it, does it? There isn't a single sentence like that in any of the books. No. So then I could say he's trans. Because nothing in the book says no. Well, that's really a very, very low standard. You could say anything about a book, a story, an idea, a piece of history, as long as nowhere in the story does it say word for word that your idea is wrong. That's a very, very low standard. Maybe poor Emmanuel Macron, who's losing his country now. I say poor, ironically. I'm really not sympathetic to him. Maybe he's really a spy for Bolivia. And he's really acting on the interests of Bolivia in a war against Ukraine. You don't know that Bolivia is fighting against Ukraine, but it is. You just don't know that, right? Where does it say no? Who contradicts that? There's an okay idea, just because nobody contradicts it. shouldn't we have a little bit higher standard for that? I'll give you another example. People say everyone has a right to an opinion. In America, they say now you have an obligation to have an opinion. Suppose somebody comes up to you on the street and says, "You're a Nazi." And you say, "What? What do you mean?" "You're a Nazi." So, well, why do you say that? And he says, "That's my opinion. I have a right to my opinion. And my opinion is that you're a Nazi." Does he have a right to that opinion? Do you get a right to an opinion because you can talk? You can walk and talk. Both. Maybe even at the same time. And therefore you have a right to an opinion? Shouldn't a right to an opinion be earned by knowing something about the subject? Having some evidence? Some experience? Some sources? I think that the Jewish Bible was written by a woman. There are people who said that. Really? Okay. Why? Well, that's how it strikes me. That's my opinion. No, I don't think you have a right to an opinion when you don't know anything about the subject. I'll tell you something. When I was finishing my doctorate in a local university in the Boston area, they hired someone whose job was to interpret biblical texts. And this person was trained in psychotherapy, so he was psychoanalyzing biblical characters. Psychoanalyzing King David, right? Psychoanalyzing Moses. That was his research specialty. He had only one scholarly weakness. He didn't read Hebrew. He was doing it in translation. Well, that's university, okay? Is that competent? Does he have a right to make these analyses without knowing the language in which it's written? I don't think so. That's his opinion. No, I don't call that an opinion. I call that just narcissism. It's so the standard has to be not just that nowhere in the book does it say I'm wrong, but rather there are things in the book that are written which indicate that I'm right. I have to have some positive reason in the book that says that what I'm saying is correct. And then when somebody offers an opinion about what the book means, you ask them which passages support you, how did you interpret them, what was your reason for interpreting them that way. You have to build a positive case for your interpretation, and not just say that nothing contradicts me. So that's the standard that we are going to use for our analysis. We're going to use the standard of finding positive evidence for what evidence we want to say about the text. Okay, one last introduction, and then I guess we'll be able to start today. Some texts operate on different levels at the same time. Let's take a parable. Aesop's fables. What happens there is, what's written in the text is a story, and the first understanding of the text is understanding the story. What does the story say? But then you have to figure out, what did the author mean to say about life, about people, about death, about ambition, because he didn't write, the story is false. The story was made up. And no one would make up such a simple story for just the sake of the story itself. So you have the fox and the grapes. The fox sees the grapes and wants them, but there's a fence going around. There's a crack in the fence, so the fox starves himself to become thin enough to slip through the crack. And he does so, and he gets into the garden, and he has the grapes, and he eats the grapes, and he's in seventh heaven, and he's enjoying himself. And then he's tired of being in the garden. He's back to the crack, but now he's too fat to get out the crack. What to do? He's going to have to starve himself again to get thin enough to go out the crack. This time he's starving himself in the garden with the grapes. He finally starves himself and squeezes out the crack. That's the end of the story. What's the punchline? Was it worth it? Do we ever do that? Do we ever set our eyes on something and make a gigantic effort to achieve it, and after achieving it, see that it's not going to lead us anywhere? Indeed, that we'll have to go back to where we were to recover what we had? Does that ever happen to us? Let's say in relationships, does that ever happen? Yeah, it happens. And in business efforts, does it ever happen? Yeah, it happens. So Aesop is making you think, look, we look at the fox and we laugh at him and we say, why didn't he think ahead? And didn't he realize? And in truth, he really ended up no better off than he was before. And then you have to think, do I ever do that? Not bad to think about that and to guard against that. So this story, this piece of literature exists on two levels. Number one, a story about a fox and grapes, and then what it teaches me about the dynamics of my own life. It's on two different levels at the same time. Many texts are like that. 100 years ago, when spies wanted to send messages back to the homeland, they're traveling in the enemy country, they would write letters. The letters were coded. They would write about the weather and about the mountain that they climbed and so forth and so on. And all these things were coded to tell them the tanks are over there and the planes are over there and the government has this person who's not loyal. It was communicating information. So on the one hand, you do have information about the tanks, about the weather, about the mountain. On the other hand, you have information about the tanks and the rest. One piece of writing can have many different dimensions. Our texts, especially the biblical texts, have many different dimensions simultaneously. Now, let's take what we said before about context. How do I know how to read a book, let's say the 5 books of Moses, which were written by the Creator? How am I going to do that? I haven't got a society, I haven't got a practice, it's not a textbook, it's not a novel. What is it? And how do I relate to it? Here, there's only one solution. The author has to tell you. And the author did tell us. I'm quoting Ramchal in the Mamar al Ikarim now. He did tell us. And he told us there are many different ways in which we should relate to this text because it has simultaneously meanings on different levels. And each level has its own method. Some are methods and some are background information that you use to interpret the text. Some of you have heard of Pardes. That's Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Sod. Those are 4 broad approaches to the text, each with its own methodology, and there are many others. So when you come to look at the text, you need to have the Jewish background. What are the appropriate dimensions to use to get meaning out of the text? And now the punchline of this part of the analysis is that the plain, logical, literal meaning of the text, which you could sort of call pshat, although pshat is a controversial word and it has lots of nuances. The way you would read a newspaper or an encyclopedia, you read the meanings of the words from the dictionary, and you analyze the sentence, you analyze the context and other things. That has no special status. The plain, literal, the pshat meaning has no special status. There are a lot of people who reflexively think like this. Look what the words say. The words say is what it means. Yeah, there are midrashim and there are Muslim and everything else. That's play. The rabbis were bored and they made up things, and in between the Aliyahs on Shabbos, you have nothing to do. You can read that and amuse yourself. But really, what it means is what it says. The straight literal meaning is what it says. That's dead wrong. That's dead wrong. The straight literal meaning is no more valid, no more true, no more precious, no more holy than all of the other dimensions, each of the other dimensions. And if the Creator hadn't told us that the straight literal meaning is a dimension, we wouldn't have known it. And maybe we would have skipped it altogether. Just skipped it. You have, like the letter with the coded information about the enemy army, the statements about the weather and the mountain are irrelevant. They're irrelevant. They have nothing to do with what the letters are designed to communicate. It's just that these words in the code tell you about tanks and airplanes. Not always is the literal meaning relevant to the meaning of the text. So if you have a text, something that's attached to the text as an interpretation, and you say, "Oh, look, I know that's the interpretation that's given, but it's not in the words," and you mean it's not in the literal meaning of the words, the correct response is, "So what? Who said that the literal meaning of the words has to be the vehicle for everything that the text communicates?" It's simply not true. So I'm going to do with you roughly what's called pshat, the literal meaning of the words, but from time to time I will introduce you to other dimensions, because it's sometimes interesting to see the interaction between them. But most of them are going to be devoted to doing the pshat of the text. Yes.
So what does a pshat mean? Like a meaning or a translation? Because I know like one text could have multiple pshat in it. So is that like a...
Okay, this is another. Thank you for mentioning that. That's another thing I really should say. My example of this, some of you have heard this already. Robert Frost wrote a poem called "Mending Wall," and it's about the farmers in the New England area, where it's really cold in the wintertime, and there's ice, and the walls fall down, and stones are cracked. And in the early springtime, if you have a wall between two properties, so the owners on each side decide to go together, walk down the wall, and repair where it's broken. He talks about it. One thinks to himself, if I had sheep and he had grain, I could understand why he'd want a wall to protect his grain from my sheep. But I'm growing turnips and he's growing watermelons, and the turnips aren't going to eat the watermelons. What do we need a wall for? And he thinks, maybe I'll suggest to him, that he suggests to the other guy, maybe we don't need a wall. The other guy says, it's springtime. We mend the wall. That's what we do. Okay, that's roughly the gist of the poem. Somebody asked Frost, is this a parable for international relations? Walls between nations, and why were they put up? And maybe sometimes they're not functional anymore, and they should be more open to one another, and so forth and so on. And he said, no, it's about walls in New England, in the spring. Okay, that's what he intended. Couldn't it also be about nations? Couldn't it have something valuable to say about nations? The meaning of a text is not under the control of the author. He wrote words. It's the words that live in the public mind, not his intention. We don't care about his psychology. If the words actually communicate something valuable that he didn't think of, the words still do that. Maybe he doesn't get as much credit for it, but that doesn't mean the words don't carry that meaning. So there could be two meanings there. So when you talk about, and this is straightforward understanding of the words, when you talk about there being more than one pshat, that can be simply correct. The words can have more than one, even literal meaning. You know what ambiguity is? Ambiguity is where a word can have two meanings. Sentences can have two meanings. Paragraphs can have two meanings, both of them based on the literal usage of the words. So if you have one commentator who offers this pshat, another commentator offers that pshat, you shouldn't reflexively ask, so who's right? And maybe they're both wrong. Maybe something else is right. Don't reflexively ask that. Ask, does the interpretation fit the words? And it could be that both interpretations fit, and both of them are correct. It could be that one thought of one and one thought of the other. The Gemara talks about that often. He said this, and really not disagreeing. Or, for the purposes of his exposition, he express this one, and the other one expressed the other one. They may have even known about the other one. They just weren't talking about it at that time. That's the statement that was associated with them because that's what they said. So even when you limit it to one dimension, there could be a variety of different interpretations. Sometimes one commentator will quote the other one and say it's wrong. That does happen. Then you have a disagreement about, in this case we're talking about pshat, you have a disagreement about what the correct pshat is. And then, because they were both the ones that we bothered to immortalize by gathering their words and having them, when you take out a Mikvos Gedolos with 25 different commentaries, these are people who are the greatest scholars over 1,000 years. So when one says the other one's wrong, our job is to figure out why did he say what he said, and why did he say what he said, and what did they differ about. Very often they have deep and subtle disagreements about methodology. What kinds of things are relevant? What kinds of things can be used in interpretation? And when we read them and we appreciate what the disagreement was about, it will be quite unobvious to us who's right, or which one is right, and which one is wrong. And what we usually say is they're coming from different approaches, and we can hope to define what their approaches are. And we just learn them all and say, look, this great scholar said this, and this great scholar said that, and that's our education. And when I was teaching in university, I used to teach the Einstein-Bohr debates, which now, according to more modern expositions, the way we used to teach it was wrong, because that's what they put in the textbooks and it was wrong. And inevitably, the students would say, so who's right, Einstein or Bohr? And I said, who are you asking? You're asking me who's right. I hope to enrich my life a little bit by knowing something about what the two sides are. And that's the end of it. So al chaskama v'kama, 1,000 times over, when we're talking about the greatest scholars in the world, dealing with the most difficult, subtle issues in our literature, we don't try to figure out who's right. We just try to appreciate the different approaches and learn for ourselves what kinds of approaches exist and are important. Okay, let's take out the blue books. This parsha. Yeah, but I'm not teaching Vayetze. Sorry, I'm going to the very, very beginning of the book, the first two words. This is on page 2 or 3, depending whether you're English or Hebrew. A good author, if he's going to do an analysis, should about what I said. No, I'm sorry. I'm not going to wait the whole. Wait for me afterwards. I'll be able to do it, but I can't do it. On page 2, what I'm telling you now is the second Rashi. An author who is going to conduct a systematic analysis ought to tell you about his methodology. Rashi is really the oldest one that we have who wrote a commentary which has been preserved. Rashi quotes his teachers, so he had teachers, and he didn't invent anything. He invented it, but he formulated in the second Rashi what his standards are. I'm going to take you through what he said, not in order, because from a modern point of view, it's not easy to follow his order, but I will take you through and show you what he did. So the first two words in the Hebrew are Bereshis bara. A literal translation of that. Anybody know Hebrew here? Know some Hebrew? Yeah. What's a literal translation of Bereshis bara? Not quite. Let's make it easier. What's the word reshis? Translate reshis. Nope. 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 Rosh is head, not reshis. Good try. No. No. If you don't know, you won't guess it. Reshis means beginning of. Beginning of. In Hebrew, Reshis HaSefer, beginning of the book. Reshis HaMeah, beginning of the century. Reshis HaMilchama, beginning of the war. It's beginning of. What sort of word should come after beginning of? What type of word?
An object or some.
A noun, right? A noun, something that names an object. It's got to be beginning of something. Gee, the next word in the Hebrew is a verb. Bara. So the strict translation would be, in the beginning of, he created. Well, sorry, you can't talk like that. After of has to come a noun, not a verb. Makes no sense in English, and it doesn't make sense in Hebrew either to say, in the beginning of, he created. Because you have to say, of what? Look at the English translation that you have here in the Art Scroll. What does it write? In the beginning of God's creating. Okay, that's because they took it from the end of Rashi's analysis. But you see, I have beginning of, because that's literally what Rashis means. So Rashi raises this question, and he makes a suggestion. He says, instead of translating the next words as God created, just a verb, why not make it into God's creating? What's the difference between created and creating? What kind of word is creating? Is it a noun? Is it a verb? What kind of word is it?
It's a process. I mean, it is a noun.
It denotes a process, but I'm thinking of grammar.
Oh, okay.
How do you determine whether something's a noun? You try to make it the subject of a sentence. Can you make creating the subject of a sentence? Sure, creating is difficult. Creating is fun. Creating is lucrative. You get paid. You get paid for it. Creating is the name of a process. The word is a name. That's why the English that's on page 3 reads okay. In the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth, that reads fine. Because you have the of attached to a noun, creating. So Rashi suggests that that's the way you should read it. And he says, there's actually a parallel to this in the first verse of the book of Hosea, where there it says, Tchilas diber Hashem b'Hosea. Let's try. Tchilas. What would the translation of Tchilas be? Beginning of. Tchilah is beginning. Tchilas is beginning of. And the next word there is diber, he spoke. So you have the same problem there that you had over here. The problem over there is in the beginning of, he spoke. No, but you can't talk like that. So Rashi says, obviously there is the beginning of the book. It's the first thing that God said to Hosea. It means the beginning of God's speaking to Hosea. I mean, this is a biblical idiom to have an of word with a verb, and the verb means with an ing. That's what it means. That's Rashi's explanation. Are we together so far? Now Rashi invents a critic and puts an attack on his interpretation in the mouth of the critic, and it's important to see how he responds to it, what he thinks is relevant to responding to it. So the critic will say, I have a much simpler solution to your problem. You want some noun to come after of. I hear that. That's important. But why not just put in an extra word? Why not say, in the beginning of everything, God created the heavens and earth. Leave created as created. Don't put an ing after it. Don't make it from a noun to a verb. Leave it as a verb. Just put it in the beginning of everything. After all, aren't there verses that leave out words and the reader is expected to understand the words that are supposed to be there? And he brings 4 examples. And in the last example, he has this word, this actual word that we're talking about, used. There's a verse that says, Magid me reshis acharis, which literally translated would mean he declares from the beginning of, the end of. He declares from the beginning of, the end of. That's what it says. Reshis is beginning of. Acharis is end of. Says the critic, obviously it means from the beginning of everything, the end of everything. That's what it means. Just that the prophet there left out the word after the of because he expected you to fill it in. So I'm suggesting that you can fill it in over here. So at this point, the critic has an objection that you did it one way, Rashi. There's just as good a way to do it, which is not your way. That's the first attack. Both of them are based on comparing this verse with other verses in other places in the Tanakh, which shows you that comparative use of language throughout the larger corpus is a relevant feature to take into account. Rashi cited the first verse of the book of Hosea. This is the book, if I remember correctly, this is a verse of the book of Isaiah. Then the critic goes on to say, listen, Rashi, the difference between you and me is that I preserve this fundamental belief of our religion that God created the heavens in the beginning, the heavens and earth. You lost that. Your translation loses that. I'll show you why. Go take a look at the English. In the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth, if we would have put a punctuation mark there, what punctuation mark could we put? Is this a whole sentence? No, it's a dependent clause. It tells me when, but it doesn't tell me what happened. Your helpful friendly translator here puts in a dash. That's not bad. It's not the end of a sentence. So let's see. In the beginning of God's created the heavens and the earth, when the earth was astonishingly empty, with the darkness upon the face of the deep, divine presence hovered over the surface of the waters. When? This is when it is. Has anything happened yet? No, nothing's happened yet. God said, let there be light, and there was light. The first event that the Torah describes, according to Rashi, is the creation of light. The first two verses just tell you when it happened, what was on stage when it took place. So the critic says, Rashi, you've given up the idea of creation out of nothing, that the world began with God's creation. I'm saving that. When I put in the word everything, I'm saving that very important Jewish principle. That's the critic's attack. And Rashi says, I hear you, but you're wrong. Your alternative explanation is not correct. And whether you're saving the Jewish idea or not doesn't matter, because you're making a big mistake. What mistake is he making? Well, let's see. Let's go back to number one. We can do this in the English. In the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth, when the earth was astonishingly empty, darkness upon the face of the deep, and the divine presence hovered over the surface of the waters. When did the waters come in? How did they get there? Who said the waters were created? Even if you read it the way the critic wants to, in the beginning of everything, God created the heavens and the earth. The next sentence takes for granted that there are waters. Where did they come from? They're there, we're talking about them, but nothing's been said about it. Now, your thought will be E-A-R-T-H. I wonder what that means. Does that mean the globe? The planet? And then maybe when it says he created the planet together with all of its ingredients, including the waters. But that's not really true, because if you turn over the page, verse 10, middle of page 5, God called to the dry land earth. That's the same word as you have in the first verse. So the E-A-R-T-H in the biblical text means dry land. Doesn't mean the globe. So back over here, Rashi says, if you read it your way, critic, you can't make sense out of the continuation. And that's something you have to do. You have to read something in context and see what's before it, what's after it, how it continues, how it develops. And you can't do that. So therefore, you're putting in the word everything to say in the beginning of everything, although it was a relevant thought, although, yes, that's what you have to do in the verse of Isaiah. He declares from the beginning of the end of, but it can't work here because waters is in the next verse. And if you tell me that I'm giving up that fundamental principle of the Jewish religion, well, I'm giving it up in this verse. Yes, I am. I will do that. I'm not here to save the principles of the religion. I'm here to understand what the text says. There are verses in the prophets that talk about this. And the oral tradition, which is part of our tradition, also talks about this. There's no end of sources for the idea that the world starts with God's creating it and from nothing else, but just creates it. Hold. So that's the way Rashi enforces his interpretation. So it's based on the grammar problem of the of that has to be solved. It's based on looking elsewhere in the Tanakh to see how the same words are used. And it's based on the context going on to make sure that the interpretation fits the context. And the saving of a fundamental Jewish principle isn't in the cards. That's not in the cards. It's not part of what enables you to enact. This is an example of how Rashi attacks the text. And this is an example of what he does when he's doing pshat. Questions of what we said up to here? Yeah.
Can we answer how the waters have been?
Maybe I didn't say it clearly enough. Rashi's position is that the text is not starting at time zero. It's not starting at the beginning. It's at the beginning of the creation of heaven and earth. That's not the beginning of the creation of everything. It's only the creation of heaven and earth. And before heaven and earth were created, there were all these other things, the darkness and the deep, whatever that is, and the waters, they were already there because they were created beforehand. But the text doesn't tell you that. The text is starting in the middle of the story. The text is starting in the middle of the story. It's not starting at the beginning of the story. Okay? Okay. Now, to illustrate what we said about different levels, Rashi brings a drush on the first words, Bereshis bara, drush from rabbinic sources. The beis in Hebrew can mean in, at, but it can also mean for the sake of. The literal meaning of the beis can be for the sake of. For example, when Jacob agrees to work for Lavan for the right to marry Rachel, and he says, I'll work for you for 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. He says it like this: E'evadcha sheva shanim be Rachel bitcha haktana. I will serve you for 7 years, for the sake of Rachel, your younger daughter. So the beis can mean for the sake of. The Midrash says, Bereshis mean for the sake of Reshis. We're now talking about why God created the world. Not when he created the world, but why he created it. What was his purpose in creating it? And then it says, the word Reshis, according to two verses much later in the Tanakh, one time the Reshis refers to the Jewish people, and another time the Reshis refers to the Torah. So the double message here in the Midrash is, for the sake of the Jewish people and for the sake of the Torah, God created the world. And if somebody says, but Rabbi, Reshis doesn't mean Torah, doesn't mean the Jewish people. How can you take a book, a verse from Jeremiah and from Proverbs, written hundreds of years later, to interpret this? What kind of interpretation is that? The answer is, it's not pshat. It's not pshat. It's a different kind of interpretation. The later writings reveal a meaning that was intended here on the basis of drush. Drush is a different dimension of interpretation. And in Rashi's commentary, he mentions the drush first. I think Rashi means to tell you, drush is very important. Don't discard it. Don't slough it off because it isn't the literal words. No, what the rabbi said in this drush is the first thing that I would say about the verse. Then he says, and if you want to explain it according to his pshat, then you can explain it the way I'm explaining it over here. He's telling you pshat is only one of the ways in which the text communicates, and he gives pride of place to drush, which is, and the quotation from the previous generations. By the way, Rashi invented this pshat. As far as I know, we have no previous record of such a pshat that he makes here, which shows you that pshat is creative. It's creative. It's got to be backed up with logic. It doesn't have to be backed up with authority from previous generations. That's the drush. Then there's remez. In the beginning of the Zohar, in the introduction to the Zohar, there's another aspect that's created, that's mentioned here. When they were forced to translate the Torah into Greek, they made certain changes. The Septuagint, the 70 scholars, they made certain changes, and they changed this because they said if we write it this way, you could misunderstand it in the following way. Bereshis, whoever or whatever that is, Bara Elohim created God. After all, you're talking about a Greek, right? There's many gods, and the gods come into existence, and so forth and so on. Maybe Bereshis is the name of something or other, and that created the God Elohim. So they changed the order. The Zohar says something else. The Zohar says, and Maimonides agrees to this, not in the name of the Zohar, but the same idea. When we talk about the Creator, all we talk about is his modes of action. That's a long story. I'm not going to go through the whole, but that's all we talk about. Beyond that, we have no understanding, no words, no conception, no descriptions, just his modes of acting. And his different modes of acting. Loving kindness is one mode of acting, and strict justice is another mode of acting. Mercy is another mode of acting. There are various ways in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu acts in the world. Maybe you've heard the word spheros for the Kabbalah. The spheros are modes of acting. Well, Elohim in the spheros refers to a particular mode of action. And the list of the spheros, counted in a certain way, it's number 3. That Elohim mode of action is what's called Bina. Above that is Chachma, and above that is Keser. And here's the way the Zohar interprets this verse. It says, the Beis has another meaning. It can mean in, it can mean for the sake of, and it could mean that you use something as a tool to create something else, to build something else, to make something else. You dig with a shovel is lachpor bedeker. The base is, I use the shovel to dig. So, something used Reshis to create Elohim. Reshis is Chachma. Reshis Chachma Yiras Hashem. So, something used Reshis, which is Chachma, to create Elohim, which is Bina. And that something that used it is Keser, unnamed. But if you know how the spheros work, you know that the top is Keser. So the picture here now is not when did the creation take place, and not for what purpose did the creation take place, but who did it? Who did it? Which mode of action was in play when the world was created? And the answer is, it's Elohim. That's the mode of action that was in play. So now, here's an example of how 3 different dimensions of interpretation come together to complement one another so as to give you a much fuller picture of what's going on. One says when, one says for what purpose, and one says who. Some of you know, you may have heard this, that Elohim stands for the attribute of strict judgment, and the whole first chapter plus the three verses of the second chapter are written with only the name Elohim, and then from then on it's doubled, Hashem Elohim. And the Hashem, the Yud Kei Vav Kei, stands for mercy, and the Midrash says God, so to speak, considered the idea of creating the world with the attribute of strict justice, and then decided, so to speak, well, this needs interpretation, so to speak, to add the quality of mercy. So then it's very important who's doing it. The initial description is being done by strict justice. And mercy is added as a supplement to strict justice. And the overall message is that since the first thought was strict justice and mercy is only a supplement, strict justice isn't abandoned. It says he added mercy to strict justice. Strict justice is there, and when necessary, mercy is operative, but when a person can actually earn through the standard of strict justice, then strict justice will be applied to him. So it isn't lost. It isn't as if strict justice wiped away. No, something's added so as to be able to supplement the activity of strict justice when necessary. So then, who's doing it, which particular mode of action is doing it, is a crucial element to be understood. So this is this example of the three different levels of interpretation and how they can fit together. And there is a statement on record from the Gaon of Vilna that although your order of study, you usually start with Pshat because that's the one for which you can use your logic and you can use open techniques like a dictionary and like the rest of the text and so forth and so on to try to figure out what it means. And the others, Drush and Remez and Sod, they require special methodologies and you learn them later. You start with Pshat, but you don't really understand the Pshat until you've gone through all the other levels. And then you come back and you see what was hiding in the Pshat that you didn't notice before. I had a very dramatic revelation, example of this. You probably have heard of the Garden of Eden, and there was a snake, and there was a question of eating from the tree of knowledge. The Torah describes the snake as more subtle and clever than all the beasts of the field. Wow. More subtle and clever than all the beasts of the field. Well, in the text, the snake talks, reasons, deceives, tempts. Pretty clever guy, right? Now imagine reading this and read the story and say, well, look at him. He's talking to the Chava and he's arguing with her and he tricks her and so forth and so on. And new piece of information, and he's smarter than a cow. Wouldn't that have been obvious from the story? Like, he doesn't sound like a cow. Ramchal writes in Adir Marom that at that time, all the animals could speak. All the animals could reason. So I thought, wow, now I understand this verse. Because they could all speak and reason, then you have to tell me. And his speaking and reasoning was superior to all of them. That's why you have to tell it to me. If you don't say that, find me a reason for that. Find me what it tells you that you wouldn't have known from the story, even if it hadn't said it. This is the kind of thing that can happen when you come across something in the deeper, more esoteric interpretations, and then you go back to the Pshat and say, wow, look at that. If I had just seen it more deeply, I would have realized that the Pshat is communicating something like that. But it didn't occur to me until I saw it in the Ramchal. So this is the illustration of the various levels. Okay, so in Yis Hashem, on Sunday we will continue.
Thank you, Rabbi.